Hello, my name is Adam Johnson, and I am so thrilled to welcome you to this final concert of the Olympia Symphony Orchestra's 2021-2022 season. We have some extraordinary music for you today, performed by some extremely talented musicians, and I can't wait to share this music with you. I'd like to take a few moments now just to share with you a little bit of detail about each of the pieces, about the musical journey that you're about to experience. So we're going to begin with the Egmont Overture by one of the most celebrated composers of all time, Ludwig van Beethoven. So Beethoven is still a household name today because of how he was basically a lightning rod for personal expression. He helped usher in the Romantic era by taking music that had been largely composed for the state or for the church, and he made it into something that became about personal expression, about his personal values. And Count Egmont was a wealthy nobleman who lived in the Netherlands in the 16th century. And at the time, the Netherlands was ruled by the Spanish Empire. Count Egmont was loyal to the Spanish Empire, yet he started to speak out against oppression, specifically against the Inquisition and against the iconoclastic movement. And just for speaking up against oppression and for standing up for what was right, he was eventually condemned to death. Now, he was warned ahead of time that he would be arrested. He chose not to flee. And he faced his execution with such a calm dignity that it inspired a greater resistance movement against Spanish rule. And so then, several hundred years later, Goethe, the famous German poet, wrote a play celebrating Count Egmont, and then there was a revival happening about 30 years after the premiere of this play, and that's when Beethoven was asked if he would like to write music to accompany the play. And he was excited to do so because this story of taking a noble stand for what is right really resonated with him. Beethoven was a great humanist and really believed in equality for all. And so this music will begin with really dark, brooding, challenging chords. You really feel the oppression, the stance of what was coming from the Spanish Empire. And you hear these brooding melodies, and it eventually will open up into a great celebration of victory, the victory of virtue over oppression. So I hope you enjoy this fascinating and powerful journey through Beethoven. We are then going to go to a completely different style of music, this time with the wonderful violin soloist Kristin Lee, and we will perform the Four Seasons of Buenos Aires by Astor Piazzolla. Now, many composers have composed music about the Four Seasons, the most celebrated being, of course, Vivaldi's Four Seasons. Well, you're going to hear a little bit of that music as well today, as Piazzolla included some aspects of some quotes, if you will, from the Four Seasons by Vivaldi in his music. And the arranger today, the Russian composer Desyatnikov, put even more of those quotes in there to make it the link between the two even more obvious. However, there's some interesting things because Piazzolla was in the southern hemisphere while Vivaldi was in the northern hemisphere. The quotes are actually in the opposite seasons. So you'll hear quotes from spring of Vivaldi in fall by Piazzolla, and vice versa. And Piazzolla was an Argentinian tango composer, but he was raised for part of his childhood in New York City, where he was exposed to jazz and to classical music. And so he never really fit into any one of those distinct styles. And he was in a sense uncomfortable with all of them, and yet wanted to find his way of sharing what he felt. And with the tango, he eventually had to create entirely his own style. He formed a quintet, a group of 5 musicians that he performed with regularly, and so that was the group with which these Four Seasons were first performed. They were not conceived as a set. Originally, they were composed over a period of about 5 years, but once they were all completed, he did perform them all together. And this music, you will hear different influences in there, and it's so rhythmical. It's the Latin fire, there's sensuality, there's great rhythmic complexity and lots of punchiness, and it's just a really fun, exciting music to listen to. So I hope you enjoy. To conclude our program, we will have the great Symphony in D minor by Cesar Franck. Now, Franck spent most of his life in Paris, but he was originally born in Belgium to parents of German descent. And so, like Piazzolla and like Beethoven, he didn't fit in with the establishment. And his father, when Cesar Franck was a child, his father wanted him to be a touring virtuoso, and it didn't quite work out for him. And so Franck actually built his career up very organically by being a church organist over many decades, working his way up until he was a very celebrated improviser, and he went so far as to become a professor at the National Conservatory in Paris, so teaching at the very highest level, not only in Paris, but really one of the top schools in all of France. And it was his students who said to him, "You must compose a symphony." And so he gave it a shot. And well, that's what you're going to hear today. It's a remarkable work where normally composers would need many attempts at a symphony to really reach full maturity. But here we have an example of a brilliant work that is, it's cyclical, meaning that in each of the movements, there's a theme or several themes that get reworked and transformed through each of the movements. And normally a symphony would have 4 movements. This one only has 3 because the second and what would normally be the third movement were combined into a single movement. And so there's some really neat formal things like that. And the sound of the orchestra is absolutely unique because Franck was an organist. And so the way he uses the instruments of the orchestra is very similar to how an organ would sound. And so this is an absolutely unique experience and it was one of the most often performed symphonies in the early part, or I'd say the first half of the 20th century. And in the last couple of decades, it hasn't been performed nearly as much. Well, this year happens to be the 200th anniversary of Cesar Franck's birth. And so I think it's a perfect time to bring this piece back into the mainstream repertoire. I trust that you will find this to be gorgeous and powerful music. And once again, I can't wait to share it with you from the stage with these absolutely phenomenal musicians from the Olympia Symphony Orchestra. So it's a pleasure to connect with you, and thank you again for being here. Have a great concert.